Hi, everybody. Dana Sparks, Director of the Real Estate Academy of America and qualifying broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors. Continuing on with this video series on the changes that the Georgia Association of Realtors, or GAR, has made to the contract forms for 2023. So please check out the playlist, 2023 GAR contract and I'll link some of the videos below. Please take our CE classes, free 3-hour CE class on the 2023 GAR contract changes. They are being taught throughout December of 2022, January and February of 2023, taught virtually as well as in person and hosted by numerous Maximum One Realty offices throughout the state of Georgia, taught by our brokers, our instructors, as well as our affiliated closing attorneys. So come check them out, check out the classes, and have some interaction, and we hope to see you in class. But in the meantime, just doing these video series on these changes so that you'll have another resource for yourself. So today's tip has to do with changes that the Georgia Association of Realtors is making in 2023 on the backup contingency exhibit and a new form. There are 2 new forms for 2023, and one of them relates to this. So the exhibit that I am talking about is GAR Form F604 Backup Agreement Contingency Exhibit, and the related new form is the F605 Addendum to the Backup Agreement. Ready for these changes? Lots of changes. Comment below. I'm interested to hear if you think if this is a good change or not. So let me set a little precedence so you'll understand where I'm going. If any of you have taken my classes before, or I'm sure I've done a video tip on this previously, prior to 2023, there may only be one binding backup contract. In practice, however, when an agent is talking to another agent, when an agent is working with a buyer and they call a seller's agent and they ask about availability of a property for sale, the listing agent, a lot of times in practice, you would hear that listing agent say, well, we're under contract and I've got several backups. Well, contractually speaking, prior to 2023, that just is not the case. Why is that not the case, Dana? Because you could only have one actual binding backup contract. Why? Because the backup contingency exhibit references the primary buyer. So there was only one binding backup. You could have lots of interested buyers and lots of potential offers, but you could only have one actual binding backup contract. Well, GAR has addressed this issue in 2023, and that's what accounts for all of the changes and the new form, the new addendum. So let me get into what the changes are, and it'll make sense. And now the way agents interact with one another communication-wise, professionally, when trying to discuss the availability of a property or the potential future availability of a property, now is in line with the contracts to match sort of how agents talk to one another. So let's dive in, shall we? Backup Agreement Contingency Exhibit, GAR Form F604. And again, lots of changes that reference that there is more than one backup. So the first change is in paragraph 1. And basically it stated, previous to 2023, it stated that if buyer and seller go binding under this purchase and sale agreement with this additional exhibit, backup agreement contingency exhibit, that puts this buyer number 2, in a backup position, a binding backup position, but a backup position to a primary buyer, and it referenced the primary buyer, so forth and so on. Now that we are contractually allowing for more than one binding backup contract for a seller, we have to reference that and reference the hierarchy and the order of buyers. So that's what accounts for the changes. So the first change is in the first paragraph, and it will state in 2023, buyer and seller acknowledge that this agreement is a backup agreement in blank place behind the primary agreement. So you're going to fill in your, this is going to have to be up to the seller, the listing agent, to fill in, because the listing agent is going to know how many backup contracts you have. So basically you're going to fill in, this is a backup agreement in first place, second place, third place, fourth place. So it's going to say buyer and seller acknowledge that this agreement is a backup agreement in first, second, third place. There's a fill in the blank there for the listing agent to fill that in. Behind the primary agreement with the binding agreement date of blank, and that's the date of the actual primary binding contract between the seller and buyer number one. For the purchase and sale of the property between the seller and primary buyer identified as, and you identify the primary buyer by their last name, and it has, as a reminder to you, in parentheses, last name of primary buyer or authorized signatory, represented by or working with blank, and that's a fill in the blank for the primary buyer's broker. And that backup buyer has no right to purchase the property unless the primary agreement and other higher priority backup agreements, if any, and which are more specifically identified on the addendum to backup contingency exhibit F605, which is the new form, attached hereto and incorporated herein, are terminated, and seller gives notice to buyer to say, blah, blah, blah. What does all of that mean? All of that means that basically when a seller goes under contract with a second, third, fourth buyer, you reference that buyer is in, you identify which place they are in the hierarchy of backup contracts. Are they in second place, third place, fourth place, so forth and so on. You identify the other contracts that the seller went binding before this contract by buyer's last name and the broker working with that buyer. So that is all, and then it references the addendum, which is the new form. So that's all in paragraph 1. And then in anytime the rest of the backup contingency exhibit, nothing has changed in terms of the backup buyer's position with respect to the contract. The timeframes haven't been changed. The only thing that has been changed is anytime that backup contingency exhibit referenced the primary buyer, it now references that there may be more than one buyer that were under contract with the seller before this contract. So for example, where it talks about termination, it says upon the closing of the sale of the primary agreement or a backup agreement in a higher position, this agreement shall terminate and buyers shall be entitled to full refund of earnest money. Likewise, when it talks about if the seller makes any changes via amendment to the primary contract or a higher backup, it references that buyer agrees to any amendments to the primary agreement or backup agreement in higher positions shall not alter the priority of this backup agreement as a backup agreement to the primary agreement and other backup agreements in higher positions. Buyer acknowledges that this backup agreement contingency shall not give the buyer a right to examine or be advised of the terms of the primary agreement and other backup agreements in higher positions or any amendments thereof. So you're just identifying that there are other actual binding contracts between the seller and other buyers that came before your contract, and they are referenced by buyer's last name, binding agreement date, and the broker working with that buyer. So again, none of the other terms of the backup have changed with termination rights for the buyer, under no penalty should they terminate prior to being made notified their primary, so forth and so on. None of that has changed. Just the reference to there can now be more than one binding backup contract. So let me tell you a little bit about the brand new form for 2023. There's only 2 new forms. This is one of them. The addendum to the backup agreement. It is new. It is F605. New form, addendum to backup agreement. And you are going to use this and attach it to the contract if there is more than one backup contract. Again, you're using this to identify the hierarchy of each backup. So it does say addendum to backup agreement, contingency exhibit, and it states this addendum is part of the backup agreement contingency exhibit blank. You reference that by letter number of the agreement with an offer date of whatever date for the purchase and sale of certain property known as, and you identify the address of the property. Then it goes on to state the following backup agreements are in higher position than this backup. And then there's a whole list. It's the same paragraph, just with a different reference number to the hierarchy. So it says the primary backup agreement has a binding agreement date of blank for the purchase and sale of property between the seller and primary buyer identified as last name of the primary buyer or authorized signatory, represented by or working with blank, and that is the primary buyer's broker. Next paragraph. The second backup agreement has a binding agreement date of blank for the purchase and sale of the property between the seller and second buyer identified as last name of the second buyer, represented by or working with name of the broker working with the second buyer. The third backup agreement has a binding agreement date of blank for the purchase and sale of the property between the seller and the third buyer identified as blank, last name of the third buyer, working with or represented by blank, the broker working with the third buyer, and then it goes on for a fourth. So in other words, again, this is an addendum to identify the hierarchy of other binding contracts, actual binding backup contracts that the seller has with other buyers. They are identified, as I mentioned, with binding agreement date, last name of the buyer, and the broker working with or representing that buyer, second buyer, third buyer, fourth buyer, so forth and so on. What do you think? Let me know. Comment below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, Director of the Real Estate Academy of America and qualifying broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.